Ladies and gentlemen, with a swipe of a pen, Donald Trump has eliminated the Department of Education. I am thrilled about this one. It is long overdue. The point of a Department of Education is to improve educational outcomes. And after spending $3 million since its inception, test scores have actually gotten worse. Only in government can that kind of failed project be allowed to continue. As always, like the video and subscribe to the channel. But before we get into the meat of it, let me play you an extremely hilarious video that will have you on the floor rolling to describe perfectly why the Department of Education should have been eliminated a long time ago.
Hi, I'm Scout. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm an interdisciplinary major at UBC. I'm in my last semester. My primary thematic focus is decolonizing academia and public knowledge systems, and my secondary thematic focus is biocultural and linguistic futurity.
For those who don't know what that means, can you give us a quick rundown?
Yeah, basically what I focus on is the promises that the institution has made and also the emergence of indigenous ways of knowing and being across the disciplines, and I feature in a lot of stuff like language revitalization, or the emergent vitality of languages rather, and just kind of a bunch of stuff. I've taken courses in over 20 departments, so
okay.
Yeah,
awesome.
This is our educational system. This is what our tax dollars are going to fund. Now, I don't know this person, but I would like to think that her parents are not funding her pursuing these ridiculous majors. And this is the inherent problem with government subsidizing college. All it did was spike demand, which incentivized the universities to create all of these fun, nebulous majors that students could pursue. That had zero to do with helping these students get a job after they graduate. The government jacked up supply, so the schools jacked up demands through ridiculous majors. But at a certain point, they couldn't keep increasing demand. Every ridiculous, nonsensical major had already been created, and that led to the soaring prices of college. I know my belief on this isn't a traditional conservative one, but I wholeheartedly believe that the government should definitely subsidize higher education for the STEM majors. It would incentivize students to be serious about school, pursue things that actually matter. They would get great jobs. It would lead to huge amounts of technological innovation. It would be critical for national defense. It would lead to massive advancement in the medical and health industries, and would be an overall massive net positive for society. But that's just my little input on it. But anyway, let's get to the man himself, Donald Trump, signing this executive order. And by the time I post this video, I'm sure some radical Obama judge will have tried to block this. These rogue judges are just absolutely insane right now. I saw a funny meme on Twitter that said, "Federal judge orders Trump to send the astronauts back to space." But Trump certainly has the purview to cut what he deems to be the non-critical parts of this department and move the critical parts that he wants to keep into other departments. The Department of Education is a scam, and I'm going to touch on that more in this video. But listen to Trump explain some of the educational statistics that we're currently dealing with after 45 years of having this wonderful department.
After 45 years, the United States spends more money on education by far than any other country, and spends likewise by far more money per pupil than any country, and it's not even close, but yet we rank near the bottom of the list in terms of success. It's an amazing stat. Those are two stats you don't want. The most money spent per pupil, and you're at the bottom of the list. And that's where we are, like it or not, and we've been there for a long time. 70% of eighth graders are not proficient in either reading or in math, 70%. 40% of fourth graders lack even basic reading skills, can't read. Students in our public elementary and middle schools score worse in reading today than when the department opened by a lot. In Baltimore, 40% of the high schools have 0 students who can do basic mathematics.
Again, I don't want to hear any of the fluff from the Democrats. What he said are the only two things you need to say. We spend more per pupil than any other country by a long shot, but yet we have the worst educational outcomes. I don't need to hear anything else about the Department of Education to know that those two stats means that it shouldn't exist. Now, of course, I am sure the Democrat outrage is going to include the sob stories and the emotional blackmail. Oh, what about the free lunch programs? What about the English as a second language assistance? What about the resources for the special needs children? Well, Trump got out in front of all of that criticism and explained what he plans to do with that.
But the department's useful functions, and such as, and they're in charge of them, Pell Grants, Title I funding, resources for children with disabilities and special needs will be preserved, fully preserved. They're all going to be so. If you look at the Pell Grants, supposed to be a very good program, Title I funding and resources for children with special disabilities and special needs, they're going to be preserved in full and redistributed to various other agencies and departments that will take very good care of them.
So there you go. The good stuff is going to stay. The bad stuff is going to go. The Department of Education has a budget of $260 billion, and our students can't read or write. All the Democrats defending this don't even realize that they've been so psyoped and brainwashed into believing that the bureaucrat state should exist by any means possible, despite the mission of these particular agencies not being fulfilled, in fact, getting worse. Look at this chart that's just from 2013 that breaks down trends in America public schooling since 1970. Reading scores, math scores, science scores have all stayed the same, if not gotten worse. But employees and total costs have skyrocketed. Imagine if all of this money that goes towards administrative bloat went towards, I don't know, paying teachers more and busting these teachers unions that don't allow teachers to be fired for being bad, and incentivize and create a merit-based system that pays good teachers more. That will incentivize people who would otherwise choose not to be a teacher, because everybody knows if you choose to be a teacher, you're basically going to be poor forever, to actually become a teacher, because there's a chance that if you do well at your job, you can make a reasonably good living. Listen to Stephen Miller explain the fraud of the Department of Education.
Well, as we know, the Department of Education here in Washington, D.C. is overwhelmingly staffed by radical left Marxist bureaucrats who are in every way hostile to Western civilization, hostile to American interests, and hostile to our founding documents and culture. And so they are using their position and influence inside the Department of Education to try to force agendas like radical gender ideology, like critical race theory, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all kinds of anti-America curricula and policies on the American people, on our students, on our children. So it's taking away from parents the ability to control and direct the education of their own kids, of their own families. So what we're going to do under President Trump's leadership and direction is to return that authority to the greatest extent possible to the local level where parents can control outcomes, while at the same time making sure that no federal funds are used to support racism, to support gender ideology, or support other ideas and principles that are offensive to the American taxpayer.
Now, here's what the Democrats always say, right? The Department of Education, it's not involved in the curriculum of the schools. That's a state, that's a local choice. And technically, they would be right. But let me tell you what the Department of Education does do. They fund NGOs, and those NGOs pay consultants to do all these studies, all these surveys, all this research to find out what are best teaching practices, what's the optimal curriculum, what types of things should kids do in school, what's the role of the teacher-student relationship. And of course, as we've seen over the last 4 years, when you have an extreme cultural agenda coming from one party, like the Democrats did, these NGOs conveniently start finding in their studies that students should be taught LGBTQ nonsense. Classrooms definitely should be decorated with pride flags. Students definitely need to be taught that black students are inferior and less privileged, and white students should feel bad for existing because they're inherently white supremacists. Imagine telling a 6-year-old that they're stepping into 1,000 years of guilt and should be ashamed of who they are. But I digress. These NGOs, with their studies and their conclusions, hold these conferences that the teachers' unions then adopt their findings to their local school district curriculums. And the Department of Education suddenly changes policies and standards. So if that local school isn't adhering to these new findings, well, they conveniently now aren't eligible to receive federal funds. So it's easy to lie and say the federal government doesn't set any curriculum, but that wouldn't be telling the complete picture, let alone even a slim portion of what the reality is. Now, this is how you know the department had to go, and the Democrats' defense of it is completely inexplicable. Here's MSNBC asking a former Secretary of the Department of Education why test scores are so bad after all these years.
You know, Secretary King, what is also true is that students' test scores hit an all-time low last year. Why do you think that is, and what do you think should be done to improve that?
Look, we are still struggling with the impact of COVID. So many students' lives were disrupted in dramatic ways by the COVID crisis. Our performance as a country is below where it was before COVID. We ought to be having a conversation about what we do about that. We know, for example, that intensive tutoring can help students make very rapid progress. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the dismantling of the department. We haven't heard any ideas from the Trump administration about how we actually improve education in this country. That's the conversation we desperately need to have.
Yes, you haven't heard Trump give any suggestions. I don't know what world this guy's living in, but that's the whole point. He believes the federal government shouldn't be involved. These local school districts will know how best to help their students get ahead, not 50,000 nameless, faceless bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. And to his point, our educational outcomes were already abysmal, and COVID just made it worse. And now the old head of the Department of Education under Biden is coming out and trying to say she never advocated for schools to stay closed. Take a listen.
COVID was a terrible time for us. And as you know, because I was on your show a lot and other shows, I wanted schools to be reopened as early as April of 2020. The issue was the fear and the issue was the safety issues. But COVID has really hurt in so many ways. But this has been a Republican talking point for a long time. And
right. It was a Republican talking point. I'm not even going to give any commentary. Let's just watch this video debunking all of that.
And if people are in high risk, they shouldn't be in school. They should be doing things remotely. Just because Donald Trump wants to take a risk with people who go to bars or beaches, those of us who have spent our life teaching kids are not going to take a risk with kids or with our members' lives.
Remote and hybrid are really the only two ways you can reopen schools safely.
You got to delay school opening because if you don't have the mask, how are you going to be able to do this? There's a huge difference between working in Walmart and working in a school.
So not only do the Democrats have zero shame about ruining the educational outcomes of a whole generation, but they also have no shame in wasting $3 trillion of United States taxpayer money on doing the exact same thing they do throughout the rest of the government, which is launder the American people's money back into their own pockets through these NGOs, into these teachers' unions, who conveniently all donated back to who? The Democrats. And because that's exactly what government is and has become, you can understand why the Democrats are fighting tooth and nail to preserve this system. It's two parts. Obviously, they don't want their money laundering slush fund scheme to end. And two, they don't want to be exposed for stealing the American people's money. If Donald Trump can prove that the federal government can be cut in half and work just as well, every single American is going to be looking at every politician of the last 40 years demanding answers. And that's why the establishment is fighting so hard against Donald Trump. So that's why this is such good news. I am thrilled. It is a good day. Another promise made, another promise kept. I tip my hat to you, Mr. President, and let's keep trucking along. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You know we're on the road to 200,000 subscribers. Turn on those notification bells so you never miss a video. And I will see you guys in the next one.